I'd like to invite our first speaker today, Jessica Turowski. Did I say that right? I should have asked before. Yeah. Okay. Who embeds community development, strengths-based comprehensive principles in her implementation of the Rural Mental Health Project in Alberta for the Canadian Mental Health Association. The project includes building local capacity within up to 150 rural and remote communities and training for community animators who are defining their vision of a mentally healthy community. Take it away, Jessica.
Lovely. Well, good morning. I'm really excited to be here with so many great partners and allies, both here in Alberta and beyond. So I'll jump right in, given the time we've got. So over the past 7 years, we've continued gaining a deeper understanding of the unique strengths and challenges surrounding mental health that rural communities and their partners navigate. Many different articles, reports, scans bring to light issues that confirm what rural Albertans have expressed. As many of us are aware, mental disorders and challenges are rising, outpacing many other illnesses and becoming one of the leading causes of disability in the world. In rural areas, there are significant barriers to accessing services and interventions for mental illness and addictions issues due to scarcity, cost, and limited travel options. And this has led to poor effectiveness due to lack of long-term follow-up. And when residents do leave their communities to access services, it results in losing access to positive supports at home and people struggling to return home, which can accelerate other issues like social isolation and homelessness. Most rural communities express the need for more local service provisions, which are definitely needed. However, small populations can be unable to sustain professional practitioners, making permanent in-person services economically or practically unviable. Rural communities have also had experts parachute in with solutions for a long time, and those solutions that have been developed and tested for primarily urban contexts. This has led to an erosion of trust as local expertise and perspectives have been neglected, or when solutions aren't aligned with local cultural values, history, or issues, leading to initiatives that are potentially short-lived and less impactful than intended. So what are we doing to advance better rural community well-being? As mentioned, we're a part of the Canadian Mental Health Association Alberta Division. And so we focus on strengthening upstream approaches that include health promotion, community development, and advocacy. So we're a community-oriented organization working to build better mental health for all. And this includes the voice of lived and living experiences being embedded in the design and implementation of the work that we do. We are in active dialogue with many rural community partners over the last 7 years and beyond, who've offered recommendations, guidance, and directions on how we implement and evaluate and our overall approach and how it was developed. So those foundational recommendations rural communities gave to us include the following at the bottom of the screen there, that there's a need for socially innovative and community-based approaches, approaches that build positive mental health and recovery, and solutions that are anchored in communities and being locally crafted. So these recommendations are supported across various different academic and practice-based bodies of knowledge, including public health, system innovation, positive psychology, community development, adult learning, just to name a few. And together across all of that, we found that they really do emphasize that there are a multitude of factors and circumstances that impact well-being and that also vary from community to community. So honoring the recommendations and guidance that we've received, our approach recognizes that rural mental health is a complex issue. Rural communities are not a monolith, and there's no silver bullet solution to address the unique challenges in each area. So instead, complex solutions are needed, which are informed by evidence, but still flexible to the unique circumstances within a community. So therefore, our approach is principle-driven in order to accomplish this, which means that principles are guiding action and behavior, but applied differently according to communities' readiness and qualities. So our evidence-informed principles include the following. So first, we recognize that mental health is more than the absence of mental illness. So there are multiple interacting factors within our communities and within ourselves that shape our mental health, including cultural experiences and values, feelings of safety and belonging, access to home, food, and other needs, along with the economic, social, and physical environments that we live in, to name a few. So we encourage local actions that weave across multiple determinants of health, or these domains, to seek opportunities for change and for innovation. Our next principle is being strength-based, which is not about being naive about gaps, but recognizing that continually relisting gaps becomes futile as people get discouraged and angry. However, bringing attention to the great people and work already taking place in community helps reframe the conversation and what becomes possible. So finding and focusing and strengthening connections across those local assets and regional assets help shift us away from the we don't have anything mentality towards taking actions from a place of pride, hope, and creativity. And next is collaboration and being community-based. So recovery and health don't happen in isolation, yet siloed approaches in communities are still very much predominant. By inviting citizens into leadership spaces and working across sectors, communities can develop actions and plans that are respectful and inclusive of diverse experiences that they have in their community. When decision-making reflects voices across sectors and groups, it strengthens connection, belonging, and collective efficacy, leading to more resilient solutions that reflect local priorities. It also, in a practical way, increases awareness and skill development among those participating, including things like listening to others, learning together, and adjusting actions based on real-life evidence that's emerging. And last is being developmental. So just like people, communities change over time, and learning mechanisms are needed to continually adjust our actions as new information comes to light. This helps us not hold on to any one solution too tightly in case it stops serving us. So aligning with all of the evidence, principles, and rule recommendations, our goals are to support healthier rural Alberta through first inspiring and supporting locally driven, collaborative, and strength-based action plans that are community specific. And second, to offer ongoing provincial level support and connections to help improve awareness, collaboration, and coordination among provincial and local allies. So our approach has three main pillars that work together to mutually support rural communities. So the first is building capacity within rural communities to initiate or grow those local teams. So we provide training and funding to a resident to offer mindsets and tools that strengthen that collective action, while funding supports animators as they facilitate those relationships and discussions. Our second pillar is the network, to create a space to continue to connect, learn, and support animators and rural communities during and after training. So animators are able to learn from each other, from different communities, and advance their common issues or topics. It's also an ongoing access point for communities and animators to learn about each other, other projects, other services, and trainings that are available. And third is that we offer grants to support the implementation of those action plans that communities develop together. So our approach is unique because we aim to stay true to our principles. So that means there's things that we don't do, including we do not provide checklists to communities, and our training is not prescriptive. We do not parachute into rural communities. In fact, animators must physically reside where they, in the community they intend to animate. And we do not have specific programs or services that we are pushing. And ultimately, because I get this question a lot, animators are not trained to be service navigators or urgent care supporters. These types of efforts and services are offered by other partners, so they're not spaces that we enter. So far we've reached around 230 rural residents representing 130 rural communities in Alberta. Animators have many different roles in their community, including first responders, communications, women's groups, and other local change makers. Around 60% of the local organizations that provide backbone support in their community are FCSS offices, and I see many of you here today, which stands for Family and Community Support Services. And I wanted to mention here next a little bit that our evaluation is supported by PolicyWise. So across the 16 cohorts of training that we've done since we got started, we found that animators have left feeling equipped to identify stakeholders, engage citizens, bring action teams together, and facilitate community discussions. Other takeaways and perspective changes included noting, an increase in confidence, as well as a broader understanding of mental health, community development, and different ways of working. So after training, these are the buckets of what we found animators tend to do in that first year. So first, contextualizing training within their own community's context, then building awareness of their community, who's in it and what's happening. Next is sort of engaging stakeholders, including focusing on non-traditional allies and community members, as well as starting or joining local conversations around mental wellness. Though not every community goes through this linearly, some communities have gotten to the point pretty quickly in being able to co-create and activate those local action plans. So when it comes to the network, it's always growing and changing, and this is a snapshot of where we are now. So there are 6 predominant streams of efforts, including partnering with others to help increase awareness and reach of existing programs or services. We host many different animator and other types of events to support ongoing learning and relationships. We gather and share resources to keep people informed without having to go to meetings. And we connect people with other communities and organizations based on common priorities. We want to make sure that we offer different types of support through things like coaching as needed or group meetings to continue that mutual support. And we are continually learning what it takes to support shared leadership and shared governance so that animators and partners continue to shape the network and how we work. So next, I'll mention briefly that our community grants have been running for about 2 years. And in that time, we've received 71 applications from 60 communities, and we've been able to distribute over 1.2 million. We have 3 different streams that are available in grants so that communities can apply for whichever is right for them and the capacity that they have. And on the right-hand side is a pie chart that shows the distribution of the different priority areas that communities have. Unsurprisingly, during the pandemic, social connections, building well-being, and improving service coordination were the top 3. When it comes to capturing the impacts from projects in the network, this has really been a developmental journey that has been supported by animators, our advisory teams, and PolicyWise. So currently, we've been co-developing our theory of transformation to really capture the wide range of activities and impacts from this sort of multi-level approach. So don't get too overwhelmed, but that's the current form of where it's at today. As you can see, it would take much more time than we have today to walk through. However, I did want to note that we focus on capturing and harvesting outcomes at the animator level, the community level, and at the network level. We use a variety of different ways of gathering information, including one-on-one calls and interviews, all of the reporting that we receive from communities, small group discussions, surveys, and we're always trying to learn more on how to gather and harvest outcomes. So suffice it to say, this is also a learning journey, not only for our team, but for each animator and each community and all of the different community partners we're working with. In our near future, we also intend on partnering with a variety of different researchers to also help advance rural-related topics that continually emerge as important areas. I would be really happy to follow up with any discussions for folks who'd like to talk more about our evaluation or potential research opportunities if anyone's interested. So here on my last slide are some of the references that you can check out that I've referenced earlier in the presentation. And I'd really like to thank you for your time. I hope it's been insightful, though I know it's been very quick. And I'll leave you with a quote from Victor Patel. No, I was right. Sorry. So I will pause there. I don't know. I haven't checked the chat, but I can stop sharing here.
That was perfect. Jessica, I wonder if you, so I know you're leading the rural mental health project in Alberta. Does CMHA have similar projects in other provinces?
So CMHA is a federation. So each federal, divisional, and local CMHA office is its own sort of board with organizations. We're the only one that has something exactly like this, but we are happy to collaborate with other CMHAs that are wanting to get something like this started.
Also, there's someone asking for your resources in the chat. I wonder if you might send it with us, and then we can send it along after the event so that folks can access.
Sure, and you mean the reference list?
Yeah, the references, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jessica. We'll have time to come back more in depth at the end of our series. Okay, our next speaker is Gina Martin, who has conducted extensive research focusing on understanding how the physical and social neighborhoods where young people live, play, and learn influences their health. Much of her work focuses on understanding neighborhood effects, such as social environments, urban-rural differences, and built and natural environments on child and adolescent health and well-being. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Is it good? Can someone give me a thumbs up? Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to start off just talking a little bit broadly about community well-being and health in rural areas, and from sort of a more research perspective, but you'll see a lot of overlap in terms of the wonderful things Jessica was saying and some of the key themes that will come out of my talk as well. So I want to start just positioning myself, just so you know where I'm coming from and sort of my perspectives, and where, you know, just sort of a frame of reference, if you will. So I'm located in London, Ontario, which is a mid-sized city on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Nipawak, and Chunungtung nations. But when you think about why am I coming to you from a mid-sized city to talk to you about rural health and well-being and rural mental health, and if I reflect on that myself, it really does have to do with my journey and my upbringing. So I grew up in a lot of different regions because of my father's work, but we did end up in Wainwright, Alberta for some time. But then at around 9, we moved to a town called Souk, BC. I haven't been there lately. I know it's grown a lot and gone through a lot of changes, but that's where I spent a lot of my formative years. And I just put this picture of the beautiful Souk River up because it's pretty, it's nice to look at. Then I ended up leaving my home community in order to, you know, get post-secondary education, which is part of my story, but it's not unique to me. So many people end up leaving their home communities because they're seeking other opportunities that, you know, maybe because of a lack of opportunity, particularly around education, we find in rural areas, people end up having to leave. So I lived in Victoria for some time, and then I ended up moving to Strathkinnis, which is in Scotland. So there's a picture there, and that's a rural community of about 900. And so when I'm reflecting about rural health, these are sort of my frames of reference. But if I think about it, because I was in such different frames of life about thinking about rural health, when I was in different communities, if somebody asked me, what are the issues of your community that affect your mental health and well-being, it would really differ based on the place I was living, but also the things I was experiencing at that time. And so these are just sort of my reflections as I go through my talk, and I invite you to also sort of reflect on your own experiences and where your own thoughts are coming from. So I want to present you with just a few definitions of rural health. This is probably not new to this audience here, but this one's from the FDA. And it's that rural health is the health of people living in rural areas who are generally located farther from healthcare facilities and other services than people living in urban areas. And this is sort of highlighting that distinct aspect of rural health that kind of comes through. This is, living more remotely, being further from services, and it's highlighting that aspect. But I really personally, I like this one from the Center for Rural Health at the University of North Dakota, that is, rural health is not urban health. And I like that it kind of highlights and allows a bit of ambiguity in the definition, because there's something distinct about rural health that isn't urban health, but sometimes it's quite hard to put your finger on. And sometimes it doesn't really it's not just limited to being further away from many services and increased travel time. So it allows for some of that, I think, some nuance. That said, there are a lot of definitions, so I've just presented you with two here. And so there are a lot of common misconceptions when thinking about rural health, and I just want to talk about them a little bit, and I'll address these in further slides. So one is that being underserved is just part of rural life. One is that all rural communities face the same issues, and Jessica really beautifully debunked this in her talk earlier. And also the idea of the rural ideal or unideal. And this is actually here, this newspaper clip is from the Scottish Herald, and this was some of my PhD research got picked up by this outlet, and the tagline drives me crazy because it says, "It is a sobering warning to any parent dreaming of raising their children in the rural ideal. Rural Scots teens drink more than their urban peers." And so it's sort of presenting into, these two parallel misconceptions, that there's this rural ideal and everyone's going to be healthier and getting fresh air and sunshine and feel connected to everyone in their community in a rural community. And then it's presenting this other side that, but that's a myth, but the other side of this is all dark and dreary, and and you have to think again about this rural ideal. So I think I like this, that it illustrates these two misconceptions, but I don't like it in that I felt like it wasn't a fair reflection of my work and the findings from my research. So just a little bit more about rural health and sort of talking about those misconceptions. Rural people have the same right to health and quality healthcare as people living in urban regions. So this is a matter of health equity. It's often not realized, but it is a health equity issue, and there is a right to health and quality healthcare. And the way that we know that this is often not being met is by looking at health behaviors and outcomes in rural communities. And when we look generally, what we'll see is some trends where often some health behaviors such as substance use might be higher in rural communities on average compared to urban counterparts. But what we want to see is that these are more comparable when we adjust for things such as age, like acknowledging that there are some demographic differences in various communities. And Jessica touched on this nicely. Again, different rural communities are going to have different health concerns. It's not appropriate to just say the biggest concern about rural communities is this. We need to have more nuance and consider the communities that there is differences within communities. And in order to develop appropriate strategies and research stemming from these strategies in order to appropriately evaluate them, we need to have a community-led focus. And that is where members of the community are considered as the key stakeholders, and that all research and strategies are developed with and for members of the community. So just a little bit more about what I mean by community-led. So that's just acknowledging the fact that rural communities are different on average from a lot of urban areas in terms of social determinants of health. So these are things such as economic differences, there's physical differences, and there's differences in the built environment that we tend to see. And again, we also see a lot of cultural differences, and there's also differences in the natural environment. And so in order to make sure that the strategies and the solutions that are coming forward are the most appropriate for the community facing issues, community partnerships and collaborations are needed in order to determine what are the strengths of the community using that assets-based approach, and also what issues exist. Where do we want to see growth? Where do we want to see some change? And how can, you know, we really think about the strengths that are existing within a community. So in order to do that, it's really important to get community input from different groups within the community, and to consider the unique sense of identity and culture of each community. So to allow for that space in order to acknowledge that, you know, rural communities can be different, and they might have their own sense of community and their own ideas about what they want to see in their community. It might differ from what someone coming in from an outside perspective would have in mind. Another important thing to think about is using upstream approaches. So there are a lot of immediate needs that are often that will come up in a community, and it's important to address those needs, but also to establish long-term and gradual change to best support the community in the long term. And so you want to be able to look at how can you do some immediate work and come up with solutions that are going to work in the short term, but also think about root causes of issues and how these can be addressed, and how change can be more sustainable. And so often this sort of change is something that's going to happen at the community level, and that's going to be addressing protective factors and risk factors. So an example might be developing spaces that already exist that people are using, but maybe extending the level of services or opportunities that are available in those spaces in order to meet the desires of the community members. So here I'm just going to present a few questions you may want to consider if you're doing research or, you know, working with community at the onset. So the first is, what are the immediate needs of the community? And then, you know, thinking about, are there any upstream factors that should be considered here in order to come up with sustainable solutions? Then who should be consulted? Is everyone who should be consulted represented at the table? Which community members are present? Are there any key voices that are missing? And then what's the best way to make sure everyone can have a voice? So for example, if there's some sort of stakeholder event and youth mental health is identified as a key issue, if there aren't young people there, because, you know, obviously an event might not draw in a wide range of young people, how can those young people be met? Would it be best to go to schools and talk to young people there and talk to teachers in the community? Again, what strengths exist in the community? So this highlights what Jessica had been saying, and the best people who to determine that are the members of the community. And also identifying what's been done in other regions, and then trying to understand, could this work here, and do we need to make changes in order to better suit what is going to happen in the community? And then also, do we need outside partners, and how can we work together? So that could be people, outside partners coming in to help evaluate where a researcher may be appropriate, or a research team. Is there a specific technical expertise that could help develop solutions and get things underway? So now I'm just going to present an example that I quite like. So it's one that I came across when I was finishing my PhD, and I was looking at these urban-rural differences in adolescent substance use, and thinking about like what would be the next, you know, the next step if we wanted to start addressing some of this. And I came across this example in Iceland. And so in response to high rates of adolescent substance use during the 90s, the government of Iceland and Reykjavik City Council, as well as a group of policymakers and leaders, and a bunch of social scientists all came together, and they had the idea that we need to explore and some new ideas in order to initiate different collaborative approaches to substance use prevention. And so they did this. And then they charted the data, and over a 10-year period, what they found was a 46% reduction in the number of youth getting drunk in the past 3 days, and a 60% decline in the use of alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. There is the caveat that since the 90s, substance use among youth has been declining, but it was a steeper decline in Iceland when they compare it to other regions. So part of this is thought to be attributed to this model. So the pillars of this model is that it emphasizes community engagement and collaboration. So a lot of people were brought to the table to kind of develop solutions. A priority was to have long-standing and gradual environmental and social change rather than focus on sort of short-term solutions. And there was the goal to strengthen protective factors and mitigate risk factors at the local community level. And then they considered different domains that influenced youth life. So parents, family, peer groups, school, and leisure time, which all happen within the community level. And then I moved to Canada, and I still always had this model in the back of my head. And I was asked to give a talk, and I wanted to present on the model. And then I was wondering, has anyone done this in Canada or anywhere else? And I came up with an example. It's the first one in Canada. And it's and I think it's quite interesting because I think it is one of the first well-documented application of this model elsewhere, and it happened to be in a rural community. So this is in Lanark County, which is in Ontario. And their goals were to enhance health and well-being of youth, and they wanted to address concerns of opiate use in the community. So this is the first Canadian community to adopt this model, and it's doing it in a rural context. And the community and the people who are working on this project partnered with researchers in order to do evaluation work and set up the project. So there were researchers in Canada, and I've included the reference there to their protocol. So researchers at Dalhousie and University of Ottawa have been working on this project. And there's also an author in Iceland, so they have that knowledge coming in as well, which is nice. And Health Canada recently did a report on this project and where it's at. And so the reference is on the slide as well, if you're interested. And what I think is interesting is that they added things. So they kind of took this model, but then they made it work for them in their community. And so they've included these indicators in their evaluation about evaluating positive mental health. So not just looking at substance use, but is this helping young people have more positive mental health? And that's an important key outcome measure. And then they've also engaged more youth into the stakeholder space, and also in order to co-create the strategy. So I think that that's a really nice example, and I think you should watch that space. And it's great that the researchers seem to be quite diligent in putting out reports as well. And then just briefly, another example to touch on is this enhancing rural and regional real estate through community learning. So this is a project with Athabasca, and it's funded by the Alberta Real Estate Foundation. And that's really looking at the real estate assets in communities and how these can be used to support sustainable, resilient, and safe communities. And so this was done doing community charrettes with multiple communities, as well as interdisciplinary research teams. And then stemming from these charrettes, learning modules are created in order to best reflect what's going on with rural communities by using these examples and what comes out of the charrettes in order to inform these learning modules. So just to summarize the key points, and I think this also stems from Jessica's talk, rural communities are not all the same. So issues facing communities may differ. Community-led approaches allow for strategies and research that meets the needs of the community. So this is an evidence-based approach. And emphasizing change in risk and protective factors at the community level can potentially lead to more sustainable solutions to support the health and well-being of community members in rural communities. Thank you very much, and there's my contact information.
Great, thank you so much, Gina. Okay, and now we will have our third speaker, Mary McGuire. So Mary is a project manager on the health and wellness team at Rural Development Network. Much of her work and research focuses on supporting rural communities and creating environments for older adults to age in place. Having led projects addressing ageism, age-friendly initiatives, and dementia inclusivity, paired with interest in how identities intersect with social systems, Mary is committed to working with rural communities and creating environments where older adults can continue to thrive. And I will hand it over to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Katie. And is my screen sharing okay, my presentation? Okay, awesome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary McGuire. I am located on Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis Nation of Region 4. And these lands are traditional meeting grounds, a gathering place, and a traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. I am a project manager on the Health and Wellness team with the Rural Development Network. And Rural Development Network, we support the sustainability of rural communities and amplify the rural voice and collaborate to identify rural issues and build local capacity and work with these communities to find innovative rural-based solutions, as those issues can sometimes be quite unique to the communities out. So we're learning through these presentations. And today I'm going to have a little chat about age-friendly communities and the value in working toward becoming age-friendly in your own community. I like this quote from the World Health Organization. I think it does a great job in summarizing what an age-friendly community is. So age-friendly environments foster health and well-being and the participation of people as they age. They are accessible, equitable, inclusive, safe and secure, and supportive. They promote health and prevent or delay the onset of disease and functional decline. To give you some background on age-friendly communities, in 2006, the World Health Organization developed the Global Friendly Cities Project. So this project brought together cities from all over the world who were interested in supporting healthy aging and becoming more age-friendly. So these cities gathered together, information from older adults in their communities and senior care providers and other groups and other folks who are interested in working toward an age-friendly community. And that information all informed these 8 key domains of community life in which communities can work toward becoming more age-friendly. So it's also important to keep in mind that all of these 8 domains, they intersect. And so those are outdoor spaces and buildings, transportation, housing, social participation, respect and social inclusion, civic participation and employment, communication and information, community support, and health services. So as I said, there's value in recognizing how these domains intersect with one another. And a good example of that is by us ensuring that public buildings are accessible for older adults, whether that be through including wheelchair ramps or access at ground level, and also including affordable transportation to get to these spaces. So maybe that's through a volunteer driving program or through shuttles. We acknowledge then that older adults are respected members of our community, right? And so their participation is valued and encouraged. And these actions are saying as much in a very direct way. I think what is a common thread through all of these presentations is how important it is to engage people with lived experience. So engaging older adults in the age-friendly initiative and in the planning is super important. When establishing a working group or committee for an age-friendly community initiative, it's important to engage them as advocates and in the evaluation of what can make their community age-friendly. As with any community-based strategy, like I said, it is imperative that those with lived experience be engaged in the work and that their recommendations and feedback are incorporated into the actions. It's also an evidence-based strategy, right? And age-friendly, it is an age-friendly thing in and of itself because it is an act of valuing that civic participation of older adults. I just wanted to touch on mental health, mental wellness, and our environment. So environments play an important role in determining our physical and mental capacity across a person's life course and into old age, and also how well we adjust to the function, to the loss of function and to other forms of adversity that we may experience at our different stages in life, and in particular in our later years, right? Both older people and environments in which they live are diverse, and they're dynamic, they're ever changing. And in working toward an age-friendly community, they hold incredible potential for enabling healthier aging and allowing people to age in their communities for as long as possible. Just another quote. Because active aging is a lifelong process, an age-friendly city is not just elderly friendly. It's barrier-free buildings and streets, and because barrier-free buildings and streets enhance the mobility and independence of people with disabilities, both young and old. So I just wanted to chat also a bit about the rural perspective. So while most Canadians live in urban areas, a large portion of seniors still live in rural and remote areas. And as we've discussed today, rural and remote communities face unique social and environmental challenges that can have an impact on health and healthy aging. Older adults looking to stay in their rural communities as they age face barriers such as limited housing, limited transportation options, and often have to travel outside of their community to access specialized healthcare. So when developing age-friendly community action plans in rural communities, these unique challenges should be recognized as a priority in the work, right? Let me talk a little bit about Olds Alberta. Rural Development Network analyzed age-friendly survey and focus group data, which was collected by the Olds Alberta Age-Friendly Committee and some of these lovely folks you can see in the photo here. And then Rural Development Network developed their age-friendly action plan for Olds based on those findings. It should be noted that Olds, specifically this committee, has been working to develop an age-friendly community for many years now, and they've worked to address the feedback received from the older adults in the community. And yeah, I think it's been about a decade they've been working towards this, and sometimes that's how it goes. That's not going to obviously be a blanket statement for every community, but sometimes you just need to focus on one of those domains at a time and just plug away at it and work towards it, right? On June 10th, I am thrilled, so thrilled. On June 10th, Olds was presented with the Age Friendly Alberta Recognition Award by the Provincial Minister of Seniors and Housing, Josephine Pon. So that was wonderful. It's such a celebration for this committee that's been working so hard for many years. And I just really wanted to spotlight these lovely folks. So what can you do to get started in developing or moving towards an age-friendly community? So the first step is establishing a committee. So creating a committee, again, going back to, of course, engaging older adults on that committee. It really provides that structure and leadership to help set those clear goals from your initiative. The next step, you want to work with your local government to pass a resolution. And passing that resolution is going to help formalize your community's commitment and offers kind of more of a symbolic and practical movement around it, right? So step 3, you want to conduct an age-friendly assessment of your community. Like I mentioned with Olds, they did survey older adults in their community based upon those 8 domains. So questions specifically around those areas. So you want to conduct that age assessment, and it allows you to better understand the current situation and kind of helps you to, it guides you in ways to improve it, right? And then the last step there is you want to create your action plan based on all that information. And it's going to be useful in setting and prioritizing actions to make a community more accessible and inclusive. It can also create opportunities for community members to become leaders and champions for those initiatives and advocates for those certain domains. I wanted to pop in some resources. I'll also share those in the chat, and I believe Katie will be sharing them also, or Kara. I did include the Olds Alberta Age Friendly Action Plan that we worked with Olds on. The Age Friendly Communities in Canada Community Implementation Guide. It's a toolbox by the Government of Canada. It'll help you better understand how you can build out the committee and what sort of things you can focus on. And Same with the age-friendly communities information and resources link at the Government Alberta page. Tons of stuff. They have templates for everything you can think of, even letters to connect with your local government. So I do highly encourage, if you want to get started on doing this work, to check out those links, and they will definitely help guide your, I guess, path and journey into becoming more age-friendly. Please also reach out to myself. I would love to chat if you wanted to discuss these things a bit further as well. And that's the end of my presentation, folks. It was lovely to be here. Thank you so much for hanging out, and look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks so much, Mary. There's just a quick question in the chat about the example that you were talking about, if health services were involved in that work.
Yes, Alberta Health Services were on the age-friendly committee with OLDS.
Great, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes now for a Q&A session with our speakers. While folks are, brainstorming their questions, I thought I would start, because one of the things I noticed across your presentations, and each of you kind of mentioned this synergy, is the focus on really including people in engagement and making sure there's representation and highlighting strengths. I wonder if you could talk about, some of the challenges in making sure that a variety of folks show up in terms of engagement or are represented, because I think one of the assumptions we often have about rural communities is that it's like totally homogenous. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit in your work, or if that resonates for any of you.
Can go. Yeah, I think sometimes it's a good approach just to have multiple ways of trying to reach people. Like if you had, for example, if you were trying to engage with older populations, and you only offered something happening at the library, but people might have mobility issues. So just I think offering different modes that people can provide feedback and trying to make that as accessible as possible is a good approach. Also, financial barriers. You don't want to do things just during working hours. People work different hours. Recognizing people's time, like some people may not be able to engage if they're overloaded. So sometimes if it's possible to provide some honorarium for people's time, that can reduce barriers. Yeah, so I think those are some strategies. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really hard to, sometimes the people you want to engage with the most are the people who aren't wanting to engage, because you want to know, what their thoughts are, and sometimes that's a real challenge. Yeah, so I think just offering as many opportunities as you're able to within what resources you have, in order to really make it is as accessible as you can in your process, and is to make sure as many voices are heard. And also going back, I think, and checking like who is at the table at various points. Is there anyone whose point of view is being missed? What does that mean for what we're doing? So even if you do move forward because you just couldn't get that engagement, always kind of keeping in mind that there could be some key people who points of view weren't represented. Yeah, and then just keep trying. Just keep trying as best you can within the resources that you have, not to give up. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I for sure echo all of that. Other things that we've heard is that there tends to be, I'll refer to it as the double dipping of the same volunteers going on every single coalition or committee meeting and being exhausted from having wearing so many hats as a volunteer. And so I think that some of those things that Gina mentioned are really important around honoring people's time and contributions. Another thing I would also consider is the design in the way that the meetings are being held. For example, like not only having them sort of that build it and they will come during office hours when a lot of people are not available for very practical reasons during the day, or sometimes in the evening. So multiple different strategies, and not expecting people to come to your meeting, but also physically going into different spaces. So some animators we've learned went to the local dump because that's where everybody would show up. And so she could have conversations. So not expecting everything being in a group setting, because that's also really foreign and uncomfortable for people who aren't in the professional fields. So, you know, local post offices, grocery stores, the dump, like the places that are the spot that everybody goes to, and having more one-on-one conversations can lead to more honest and authentic engagement and conversation, so that you can learn about what's going on and then sort of correspondingly design any group meetings in spaces that people are comfortable. You know, for example, if there's any history with the particular building, it might not be good to, you know, wanting to use those spaces. So those are some things that volunteer and design would be the other added pieces I mentioned.
I grew up in a small town in Nova Scotia, and I can like immediately think of the Tim Hortons where I would hold something.
Or A&W, that's
that's the Alberta one. I learned that when I moved here. Mary, did you want to add anything from your experience?
I was just going to echo what they've both said, especially the piece around just meeting people where they're physically at, and trying to find spaces that are accessible and inclusive spaces. Like if you, for example, wanted to meet in a localized place in the community, you might want to avoid going to churches or something that could be a bit more exclusionary to people who don't practice a certain faith, right? So maybe go for a library or the local Tim Hortons, and keeping all of those things in mind. And I also think like a piece around the engagement in the actual meetings would be creating like a lot of space for people to share their experiences, right? So it's not just about hammering out and getting feedback on certain things. It's about sharing your own stories and creating an environment where people could feel very, or at least a bit more comfortable in sharing those stories. In that, but that's also has so much value in connecting all of us in those engagement sessions.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has a question, feel free to put it in the chat. The other thing I just want to highlight that I thought was interesting from all the presentations was kind of this commitment to like emergent or iterative design. So I love, Jessica, how you talked about it as like not holding on too tight to something because it might not serve as you keep going. Like I loved that thinking, in contrast to, you know, someone who parachutes in and is like, here's your program, I'm out of here. And I think that's good learning for almost any project we take on, right? Being responsive and developing with folks. Lorelei.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about funding. So in the charrettes, as well as other community work that I'm doing and have done, I hear continuously about the lack of funding that's really impacting the kind of particularly mental health services that can be offered. And I wonder, as a group of, you know, probably very engaged people, you know, what you might offer in terms of how do we, you know, create a shift within our culture or a shift within the political realm to actually have more resources going towards mental health. Because with the opioid crisis and all this, it just seems like, you know, there's all these indicators, but there's, you know, you ask people on the ground and they commonly say there's just not enough resources. So what can we do?
Thanks, Lorelei.
That's a really big question. I would say, yeah, I think things like this are really important for building advocacy and trying to, you know, just sort of develop awareness around the mental health issues people are facing. You know, it's particularly that in rural communities, this could be potentially overlooked. So I think, yeah, it's a big question. I think from more of a research standpoint, I think we do see a move towards more mental health work, particularly after COVID. There's an interest, particularly with young people. So I think things are shifting that way. I think it's just, you know, the wonderful work of like the Mental Health Commission of Canada and you know, supporting that work and getting the word out in order to create a space where that's valued and seen as important. That was a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but it's a big question, so I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Gina. Thank you. And I think I would see it from two levels. I'm a different level sort of thinker. One is that even when we have grants available, there can often be a struggle to apply for grants that are available because of in rural communities, the reality is that any one person can have multiple hats on in their professional and personal lives. So taking on the responsibilities of completing an application form, doing the reporting and all of the evaluation impact is asking a lot. And so the grants that are available tend to go to larger centers that have more capacity and expertise in being able to complete application forms that are great because they have a purpose, but they're also really not very equitable in terms of being able to access and meet communities where they're at. So I think that part of that is helping build, strengthen capacity and supports to communities that want to apply for funding so they can be successful without being overburdened. And also, I think doing a better job on the provincial landscape of pulling together the different funding resources that are available and having ways that, you know, communities can access the ones that are meaningful to what they care about. And so, you know, we can always, and we always do advocate to government for more funding, but I think it's also making better use of the things that are available, because I think that on the provincial stage and the funding stage, funders are just as guilty as being siloed. So I want to put the onus back on us too, I think, so that it's sort of a shared investment from everyone.
Thanks, Jessica. Mary, did you want to add something?
When I think about like how can we influence the government, for to say it very broadly, to provide more funding when it comes to mental health, mental wellness, and well-being. I always think about and again, this might sound fluffy, it sounds cliche, but like, how do we create that cultural shift on a higher level? And it's oftentimes, I think about it coming back to reducing stigma, right? And how do we normalize that this is happening, or that there needs to be more funding for all these programs and initiatives in rural communities, because this is a normal experience. People, their mental wellness fluctuates throughout life experiences. And then, you know, I think about how can we create momentum around that? And then, of course, finding those influencers in your community, in your rural community, to elevate that message and maybe even share their own stories if it's safe for them to do so. Are just a couple of things I was thinking about to create a bit of a cultural shift around it and influence government and providing more funding in those areas.
Thanks, Mary. That's great. I just want to add that, you know, one of the intentions that we had with setting up this whole series was to connect communities who are working on similar issues in order to both collaborate, but also to share skills and capacities and ideas. And one of the things we heard in our last session, which was on rural communities and housing, was that for many of the funding structures, rural communities don't have access to even the data to prove that they need funding for affordable housing. So how can we really make it clear that we need affordable housing if, you know, at our community level, there isn't the Statistics Canada data that we need to prove it? And so we heard from RDN about some of the work that they're doing on leading accounting for the need for affordable housing, or doing point-in-time counts for houselessness in rural communities. So I think, you know, one of the pieces too is to see rural communities as unique and experiencing their own circumstances, but also how to collaborate and sort of elevate what each community is doing. So it's been exciting to kind of see that happen in the chat as we're going through this series as well.
Oh, sorry, I had one more thought around funding. Lisa Riddell from Jasper she was intending to come to share what their community is doing, but because of the fires had to step away. But one thing that their community has done really Interestingly, and for over 20 years now, is they have one community group that kind of talks about all of the different determinants of health. And so funding has a regular cycle depending on whatever government priorities are. So switching from early childhood to senior or elder abuse to mental health to recovery. And so their one group has stayed cohesive. So no matter what the issue is, there's still a line of sight through connecting well-being. And that also has helped them as a community be able to collect information to be more opportunistic of new funding opportunities as they come, instead of having to do all that legwork. So I'll share some of Lisa's wisdom to the group.
Thanks, Jessica. That's great. Okay, so now what we'd like to do is move into our breakout rooms. So Kara has put the topics in the chat. Maybe Kara, if you can just paste them again, because the chat kept going, so that it's present there, and then we'll add the breakout rooms and you can choose which one. And you know, from this conversation around funding and engagement, I think the breakout rooms kind of dovetail nicely. So the first room is around rural well-being assessment. So what is work happening right now in your community that's supporting well-being, and how do you know? Thinking about the second group is thinking about neighborhoods and well-being. So what are the social and physical aspects that are happening in your community impacting well-being and mental health? The third one is, what does your community need? So kind of needs assessment, what's missing. And then finally thinking about inclusive communities. So what systemic or bigger shifts are needed to address the needs of older adults in your community? So that kind of age inclusive piece that Mary brought us to at the end of our presentation. And Karen put them in the chat, and you should be able to see that they're open for you to choose now. And we'll have about 10 minutes in our rooms to chat, and then we'll come back and I'll ask you to share.
So there were 4 people who graciously offered information about what's going on in their community, and it was unbelievable, the number of initiatives. So I can't go through the entire list, but I wanted to say that I did ask them to share their contact information, and we'll put that up on the website in our notes about this, so that people can connect with them and find out more. But it was kind of amazing to hear all the initiatives that people are involved with.
Great, thanks, Lorelai. I think that also speaks to some of what we were talking to about, like sharing and learning from each other, like having more opportunities to hear what folks are working on. Anyone else want to share stuff that came up in your session?
I know with our session, we were in group 4 around inclusive communities. It was the same sort of thing that naturally happened, is we're just all talking about what we've been focusing on, what our major concerns are in the community. And as we wrapped up there, we did get into the inclusive communities piece briefly. And I just was talking about how ageism is, for older adults at least, is the underlying issue around having accessible services to older adults and accessible housing. It really does come down to ageism and who is valued in our community, and working from that place in tackling the ageism issue, and working on maybe anti-ageism campaigns or whatever that may be. It can kind of tackle that root issue first. So, I mean, because unfortunately, when things aren't being funded, like housing for older adults and community health programs, it's kind of telling us right away that there is an ageism problem, and that you will feel less valued in your community if those things aren't being addressed. So I'm rambling on now because I'm running out of brain power, so just gonna mute myself.
That's great, Mary. And I think connects to some of what we were talking about earlier in terms of like engagement, right? So if we really start to unpack how ageism and other kinds of, structures influence how we think about who's showing up or how people get there, that'll also really, is really influenced by our perceptions of people. Yeah. Janelle, did you want to share? I saw you turn your camera on.
Yeah, I turned my camera on. And I just want to say that I have not staged the rural prairie. Behind me just happens to be where I'm sitting. So in in group 3, it was really interesting because we were talking about what does your community need in terms of mental health and well-being, and one of the participants' internet was cutting out really badly, and so it inspired a conversation around access to internet and resources in communities where I know in the community where I live, there's not a ton of mental health supports. You need internet, or you need to be able to drive, and there's no buses. And so, it's become such an issue around accessibility. And then we also got to hear some wonderful stories about some really strong, work that communities are doing in terms of awareness and support around mental health resources and supports. And a cool thing where they've created a space like in the FCSS building where mental health workers can come and stay, and people can access them in discreet ways, because that's another major issue in these rural communities is I hear it all the time, right? Like, I'm not going to go see myself, like be someone I went to high school with, right? Like, and everyone will see me going there. And, so there's, people want some privacy around it. But it also just, having spaces where people can stay and go and be in the community, right? So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Janelle. That's great. Yeah, I often think about the sort of like benefit and challenge of a small community is like everyone knows your business, and which can be really great or really hard. And that's a great segue into plugging our next 2 sessions. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. So appreciative of the conversation and everything we've learned. We have 2 more sessions in our series. So next week, Wednesday, same time, we'll be talking about encouraging rural immigration and building welcoming communities. And our 4th session, which is the sort of dovetail from what Janelle was just sharing, is about the digital divide. And so in that, we'll be talking about sort of the infrastructure piece, but also some of those kind of structural pieces that Mary signaled to, of why there's access and why there isn't, and what access might mean. So hopefully we'll see you all there at our next sessions, and thank you again for coming.